The bell above my coffee shop door jingled on a busy Saturday morning, and I looked up from behind the espresso machine the way I always did, with a smile ready. The smile died instantly. My entire family was standing in the doorway of Marigold Coffee. The same family that had cut me off 4 years ago like I was a bad debt they were finally clearing from the books. My father, Mark Henderson, walked straight to the counter without hesitation, the way a man walks into a room he believes belongs to him. He looked around slowly, taking in the warm lighting, the full tables, the chalkboard menu I had rewritten 100 times to get just right. Something moved across his face. Impressed, maybe. But he hid it quickly behind the expression I had known my whole life. The one that said he was already calculating what he could take. He leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. "Nice shop you've got here. Since we're family, I'll be taking 15% of the profits." I laughed. I actually laughed, because surely no person walked into their estranged daughter's business after 4 years of silence and said something like that with a straight face. He wasn't smiling. Then he added one quiet sentence that turned my stomach completely cold. "Or we tell everyone the truth about how you abandoned this family." Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. To understand what happened that Saturday morning, you need to understand what happened 4 years before it. My mother, June Henderson, died on a cold Tuesday in November. She went quietly, the way she had lived, without making a fuss, without asking for more than she needed. She loved roses and strong coffee and laughing at her own jokes before she finished telling them. She was the best person I had ever known, and when she left, she took a piece of the family's foundation with her. My father grieved for approximately 4 months. Then he met a woman named Wren at a church fundraiser, and within 6 months she had moved into my childhood home. Within 8 months they were married. Within 10 months, everything I thought I knew about my family had been quietly rearranged around Wren's preferences and my father's desire to keep his new wife happy. Wren decided early that I was a problem. I was too independent, too vocal, too unwilling to nod along when things didn't make sense. She told my father I was selfish and draining the family's peace. My father, who had never once in my childhood called me selfish, started using that exact word about me by the end of the first year. The final break came on a gray Wednesday afternoon in March. I had just lost my job. The marketing firm I had worked at for 6 years downsized without warning, and I was among the first wave let go. I drove to my father's house because I didn't know where else to go. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't even asking to move back in. I just needed to sit in a familiar kitchen and hear a familiar voice tell me things would be okay. Wren opened the door. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has shown up uninvited to a party they were deliberately not told about. My father appeared behind her. I told him what had happened. He listened with his arms crossed. Then he said the sentence I have replayed in my head more times than I can count. "You're 40 years old. Figure your life out somewhere else." He closed the door. I sat in my car in his driveway for a long time. Then I drove to a cheap motel on the edge of town and paid for 3 nights with the last of my checking account. 3 weeks later, my aunt called to let me know I had been removed from the family trust. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. I found work at a diner 2 miles from the motel. Double shifts, 6 days a week, aching feet and coffee-stained aprons and customers who treated servers like furniture. I moved out of the motel and into a single room I rented from an elderly woman named Mrs. Payne who didn't ask many questions and appreciated that I was quiet. My younger brother Colin stopped answering my calls after the first month. My father's number went straight to voicemail, and then one day it didn't even do that. I sent 2 letters to the house address. I never got a reply. The loneliness was enormous. It had a weight and a shape, and it sat on my chest every morning when I woke up and every night when I tried to sleep. The only thing that cut through it was one specific memory. My mother standing at our kitchen stove on a Sunday morning, measuring coffee grounds with a small silver spoon, humming to herself. She always made it too strong and she never apologized for it. She used to say, "One day you should open your own place, Clara. You have the gift for making people feel at home." I held on to that memory like it was the only warm thing left. The diner owner was a quiet man named Pete who noticed everything but said very little. After about 3 months, he started noticing something specific. Customers kept asking about the coffee. Not the diner's regular coffee, which came from a bulk tin and tasted like it. They were asking about the coffee on the mornings I made it. I had started adjusting the grind, the water temperature, the ratios, small things that made a large difference. One afternoon when the lunch rush had cleared, Pete leaned against the counter and looked at me thoughtfully. "You ever think about opening a place of your own?" he asked. I almost laughed out loud. I had exactly $2,000 in a savings account. I had no credit history worth mentioning. I had no business experience beyond watching a lot of small operations succeed and fail from the inside. But Pete introduced me to a man named George Adler that same week. George was a retired businessman who spent his spare time mentoring people who were trying to build something from very little. Pete said George had helped 3 other people in town get started and that he had a good eye for potential. I met George at a corner table in the diner on a Thursday afternoon with a 3-page business plan I had written by hand in my room the night before. He read every page without speaking. Then he looked up and said, "You're not crazy. You're just early." Opening Marigold Coffee required every dollar I had and a level of faith I had to manufacture fresh every single morning. I found a small vacant space on Clover Street that had housed a failing sandwich shop. The rent was low because nobody wanted it. 3 other people had tried and walked away from it in 5 years. The location wasn't perfect, the foot traffic wasn't guaranteed, and the kitchen needed work that I mostly did myself on weekends with borrowed tools and tutorial videos. Everyone I mentioned it to said the same thing in slightly different words. Coffee shops fail all the time. The market is saturated. You have no experience running a business. You're starting too late. I named it Marigold Coffee because marigolds were my mother's favorite flower. She grew them along the front walk of our childhood home every summer in fat orange clusters that she said kept the bad energy away. I opened on a Monday in October with 6 tables, a secondhand espresso machine I had spent 2 weeks learning to use properly, and a small display case of pastries I had baked myself the night before. By Friday, I had run out of pastries twice. 6 months after opening, a local food blogger named Tess came in on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. She ordered a cortadou and a slice of the lemon olive oil cake I had added to the menu after 3 customers asked if I could make it. She sat by the window for an hour. She didn't tell me who she was. She paid, left a generous tip, and walked out. 4 days later, her review went up online. She called Marigold Coffee the most genuinely warm cafe she had visited in years. She described the cortadou as nearly perfect. She said the atmosphere felt like being in someone's home on a Sunday morning, which was exactly what I had been trying to create since the day I painted the walls. Within 2 weeks, every table was full by 8 in the morning. I hired my first employee, a sharp and dependable young woman named Emma, who became my manager within 6 months because she was better at the front of house than I would ever be. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't surviving. I was actually building something. A few months before my family walked through the door, one of my regulars said something that should have been a warning. His name was Phil, and he came in every morning for a large black coffee and a blueberry scone. He was a chatty, good-natured man who worked in commercial real estate and knew most of the business community in town. One morning he looked up from his newspaper and said, "You wouldn't happen to be related to Mark Henderson, would you? The real estate guy?" I said yes and left it at that. Phil shook his head slowly. Tough year for him. Couple of bad deals back to back, I heard. Banks are getting nervous. I nodded and refilled his coffee and moved on to the next table. My father's financial troubles were not my concern. He had made that arrangement himself the day he closed the door in my face. But I filed the information away in the back of my mind, the way you notice a weather change even when you're not planning to go outside. So there I stood behind my own counter on a Saturday morning with a line of customers waiting, and my father leaning across the counter demanding 15%. My brother Colin stood slightly behind him, wearing the small smirk he had worn since childhood, whenever he thought I was about to get into trouble. Ren stood to the side with her arms folded, scanning the cafe slowly the way a person scans a room they are mentally rearranging. I set down the portafilter I was holding and looked at my father directly. "Why would I give you anything?" I asked. His smile turned the way metal turns in cold weather. Because family businesses belong to the family, he said. You built this on the Henderson name. I almost pointed out that he had spent 4 years making it very clear I was no longer part of that name, but I held it in. Then he said something that genuinely stunned me. He claimed he had invested money in my original idea years ago. That there had been a conversation and understanding, something that gave him a stake in whatever I eventually built. I stared at him. He had never given me a single dollar. Not when I lost my job. Not when I was sleeping in a motel. Not once in 4 years. He leaned closer and said, very quietly, "Legal battles are expensive, Clara." Then he made a decision that showed me exactly how little he understood about what I had built in that cafe. He raised his voice. Not screaming. Just loud enough to carry across every table in the room. Loud enough for the Saturday morning crowd to hear clearly. After everything this family did for you, he said, this is how you repay us? We raised you. We supported you. And now that you're doing well, you pretend we don't exist. The cafe went quiet in that specific way that happens when people stop pretending they aren't listening. Ren sighed heavily and shook her head like she was watching something deeply disappointing. Colin looked at the floor and then at the ceiling, performing discomfort for anyone watching. I felt something old and familiar move through me. A shrinking feeling. The feeling of being 16 and wrong about something I hadn't done. The feeling of my father's disapproval pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. For about 4 seconds, I felt completely powerless. Then Emma stepped forward from behind the counter. Emma was 26 years old and had the kind of quiet confidence that made difficult people instinctively recalibrate. She stepped up beside me and looked at my father with an expression that was perfectly polite and completely immovable. She built this place herself, Emma said clearly. I have worked here since the beginning. I watched her put in 18-hour days to make this cafe what it is. I watched her fix equipment, bake through the night before inspections, and cover every shift when we were short-staffed. Nobody funded this. Nobody helped build it. She did it alone. The room was very still. My father turned his eyes on Emma with the look he used on people he considered obstacles. You stay out of family business, he said. Emma didn't move an inch. And then, from the back of the cafe near the window, a chair scraped against the floor and a man stood up slowly. His name was Warren Bates, and he came into Marigold Coffee every single weekday morning at 7:55 without fail. He was a slim, composed man in his late 50s who always ordered a plain Americano and occasionally the almond croissant. He was friendly in a reserved way, and I knew he was an attorney because he had mentioned it once when I asked what had him out so early every morning. He said he liked to read case files somewhere that didn't feel like an office. He walked toward the counter with his coffee cup still in his hand, unhurried. He looked at my father and said calmly and clearly, unless you have a signed legal agreement, a witnessed contract, or documented financial records showing a transfer of funds, you don't have a claim to anything in this building. My father's jaw tightened. Warren set his cup down on the counter. I'd be happy to look at whatever documentation you have, if you'd like a second opinion. The confidence in my father's posture shifted slightly. Not gone, but dented. Ren reached into her handbag and produced a folded document. She placed it on the counter with the careful movements of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She said my father had supported my original business vision years ago. That the document proved his involvement in the early planning stage and established a basis for shared profits. I looked at the paper. I recognized it immediately. It was a photocopy of a loan application I had put together in the months before everything fell apart with my family. I had shown it to my father at the kitchen table one evening, asking for his feedback, hoping he might know someone who could help me. He had looked at it for about 2 minutes, said it seemed risky, and slid it back across the table without another word. Ren and my father had kept that copy, and now they were presenting it as evidence of an investment. I felt the audacity of it like a slap, but I kept my face neutral. Warren picked up the document and examined it in the quiet way of a man who does this for a living. Warren turned the document over once, then set it flat on the counter and pointed to the bottom of the page. The signature line was completely blank. My father's name was typed below it in the standard loan application format, but the line itself, the line where a cosigner or financial supporter would have put pen to paper and made anything legally binding, had nothing on it. Not a signature. Not initials. Not a date. Warren looked up at my father. "There's no signature here," he said. "This document doesn't establish a legal agreement of any kind. It establishes that she showed you a loan application. That's all." My father's expression darkened considerably. Colin shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Ren took the document back and folded it with sharp, precise movements, the way a person folds something they are furious at. For a moment nobody spoke. Then my father, stripped of the document that was supposed to be his anchor, did what people do when their planned approach fails completely. He stopped pretending this was about principle and told the truth. "My business is in trouble," he said. He didn't say it the way someone says something they are ashamed of. He said it the way someone states a fact that they believe obligates another person to act. The banks were pulling back. 2 major deals had collapsed in the same quarter. He owed money to people who were no longer being patient about it. His income had dropped by more than half in under a year, and the situation was getting worse, not better. He said Marigold Coffee was clearly profitable. He had done his research. He had driven past it multiple mornings before coming inside. He knew what a full cafe on a Saturday meant in terms of revenue. And because I was his daughter, he believed the right thing, the family thing, was for me to share what I had built with the people who had raised me. He actually used those words. The people who had raised me. The same people who had removed me from a family trust, blocked my phone number, and closed a door in my face on the worst afternoon of my adult life. Then he said the sentence that finished whatever was left of my silence. He looked me in the eye in front of a full cafe and said loudly, "You wouldn't even have the work ethic if I hadn't raised you." Something that had been pulled very tight inside me for 4 years finally released. Not in anger. Something steadier than anger. I looked at him without flinching. "The work ethic you're describing," I said clearly, "is what I used to survive after you told me to figure my life out somewhere else. It's what I used when I was working double shifts in a diner and sleeping in a rented room. It's what built everything you're standing in right now." The cafe was completely silent. "You didn't build my work ethic," I said. "You tested it. And it held." A woman at the nearest table set down her cup. Someone near the window cleared their throat quietly. I could feel the room absorbing every word. My father opened his mouth. I kept going. I told them something I had not planned to reveal that morning. I told them that Marigold Coffee was not just surviving. It was profitable enough that 3 months earlier I had signed a lease on a second location downtown. The build-out was already underway. We were scheduled to open in 8 weeks. Colin's smirk disappeared completely. Ren looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something between surprise and recalculation. My father stared at me like I had just spoken in a language he didn't recognize. I had not told anyone outside my small circle about the second location yet. I had kept it quiet deliberately, the way I kept most things quiet, because I had learned that announcing things before they were finished gave other people time to find ways to interfere. But standing in my own cafe with my father demanding a percentage of something he had contributed nothing to, it felt important to let him understand the actual scale of what he had walked into and underestimated. There was still one more thing I hadn't told him. George Adler had been more than a mentor from the beginning. In the early months when the cafe was finding its footing and I needed a small injection of capital to cover equipment repairs and a second espresso machine, George had stepped in quietly. He became a silent partner. A small equity stake, carefully documented, properly signed, entirely legitimate. He took no role in the daily operation. He trusted my judgment completely and asked only to be kept informed. More importantly, George was protective of what we had built together. He did not like people who applied pressure to small businesses. He had seen it too many times in his career and had very little patience for it. I had called him the previous evening when I noticed my father's car parked across the street from the cafe for the second morning in a row. I had a feeling something was coming. George had listened carefully and said he would stop by in the morning. I hadn't expected him to arrive quite so precisely. But as my father processed the news of the second location, the bell above the door rang. George Adler walked into Marigold Coffee with the unhurried ease of a man who had never needed to rush to make an impression. He was 71 years old, broad-shouldered, with white hair and the kind of steady eyes that made people feel they were being read very accurately. He had built and sold 2 logistics companies over his career. He sat on 2 nonprofit boards. He was known and respected in the business community of our town in the way that people are known when their reputation has had decades to solidify. He nodded at Emma. He nodded at me. Then he looked at my father. My father looked back at him. And something changed in my father's face. They knew each other. Not well, perhaps, but enough. In a town the size of ours, the business world had a way of making sure that people who operated within it were at least familiar with each other's names and histories. George pulled up a stool at the counter and sat down calmly. "Mark," he said. "It's been a while." George didn't raise his voice once. He spoke the way experienced people speak when they want everyone in the room to hear them clearly and know they mean every word. He explained to the cafe, to my father, to Colin and Wren, and to everyone sitting at those tables that my father had a particular reputation in local business circles. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that ended up in newspapers. The quiet kind that spread through conversations over coffee and phone calls between people deciding who to trust. A reputation for pressuring partners. For arriving after the hard work was done and finding reasons why he deserved a share of it. For using personal relationships as leverage in business situations where they had no legal relevance. He said this reputation was exactly why 3 banks had recently declined to extend my father's credit lines. He said it calmly and factually, like he was reading from a document. My father's face cycled through several expressions very quickly. George looked at him steadily. "I'm Clara's business partner," he said, "formally and legally. So when you threaten her, you're not talking to a daughter standing alone behind a counter. You're talking to both of us." George let a beat of silence settle before he continued. "If you threaten this business again or attempt to pressure Clara publicly or privately, I will make sure every business association, every networking group, and every investor contact I have in this region knows exactly what happened here this morning," he said. "I have been around long enough that those calls get returned." My father stood very still. It was a strange thing to witness. He had always been the largest presence in any room I had shared with him. The person whose approval rearranged everything around it, whose displeasure cast long shadows. Watching him stand in my cafe and become smaller under the quiet authority of a man who simply told the truth was something I had not expected to feel quite so much. Colin had stopped smirking entirely. Wren looked at my father, waiting for him to do something, say something, produce some final move that would turn this around. My father looked at George. Then he looked at me. For the first time that morning, something other than calculation moved across his face. But Wren was not finished. Wren turned to me directly. She dropped the legal pretense and the document and went straight to something older and more familiar. She said I needed to think about what I was doing to this family. That my father had made mistakes, yes, but he was still my father. That the right thing, the decent thing, the thing my mother would have wanted, was for me to help when family was struggling. She said family loyalty had to come first. I looked around my cafe slowly. I looked at the walls I had painted myself on cold October evenings when my arms ached and I had to be back at 6 in the morning. I looked at the menu board I had rewritten until the words felt exactly right. I looked at Emma standing beside me and Warren still at the counter and the regulars at their usual tables who had shown up every morning and made this place real. I thought about the word loyalty. I thought about what it meant and who had practiced it and who had simply expected it from others without ever offering it back. I took a slow breath. I looked at my father, then at Wren, then at Colin. I spoke quietly enough that they had to pay attention to hear me, which was something my mother had taught me without meaning to. She never shouted to be heard. She just made her words worth listening to. "If family meant something to you," I said, "you wouldn't have thrown me away." Nobody spoke. "I didn't abandon this family," I continued. "I survived being abandoned by it. There is a difference, and every person in this room heard enough this morning to understand which one of us actually left." My father opened his mouth. I shook my head once. "You have no legal claim to this business. You have no signed agreement, no documented contribution, no basis for any demand you've made this morning. George is my partner and Emma is my manager, and this cafe belongs to the people who built it." I picked up the portafilter I had set down 20 minutes earlier. "I think it would be best if you left now." My father had no more moves. He knew it. The room knew it. For a long moment he simply stood there, and then he turned and walked toward the door with Wren close behind him. Colin followed without looking at me. The bell above the door rang.